was September 19th, 1999, and 48-year-old Susan Fassett just knew in her bones that her own personal day of reckoning was coming. As soon as Susan stepped out of church that morning and away from the tight knot of friends all busy saying goodbye to each other, the too bright smile on her face was instantly replaced by the lines of strain and worry that seemed to get deeper every time she looked in the mirror. There was just no getting around it. Over the last 4 years, Susan had made a terrible mess of her life, and now she and her husband of 24 years would have to pay for their mistakes. The day was coming, or maybe it was already here, when she and Jeff would have to look, together and deeply, into the neglected and now poisoned core of their 24-year-long marriage. As Susan walked, pulled out her car keys, and headed towards her brand new gold Jeep Cherokee, she barely noticed the bright sun glowing through the leaves of the maple and oak trees in the woods beyond the parking lot. When she and Jeff had first moved to the tiny town of Pleasant Valley with its 9,000 residents, Susan had thought it was one of the most beautiful places on earth. And it was, with its rolling hills and acres of cornfields stitched with old colonial-style homes set on nice big lots. Pleasant Valley was one of those places that actually lived up to its name. And for Susan and Jeff, the location was perfect. They could live and raise their family in a safe, quiet, affluent community where everyone knew and watched out for one another. And the city where they both worked, the town of Poughkeepsie, 10 miles to the north, was just a 20-minute commute away. But now, Pleasant Valley, like everything else in Susan's life, felt tainted and claustrophobic, like these beautiful walls were slowly closing in on her. Climbing into her car, Susan's shoulders slumped. The problems in her marriage had probably started a long time ago. Her job as a personnel director at Poughkeepsie Town Hall and Jeff's grueling overnight shift as a lieutenant with the Poughkeepsie Police Department had left them with so little time for one another. And now that their oldest son, Jason, was 20 and their younger son, Christopher, was 17, Susan and Jeff were no longer bound together by all these shared responsibilities of the children's school and sports and social activities. But in the last 5 years, something much worse than two people drifting apart had also happened. Because for Susan, her work, or at least the person she had met through her work, had also led her to break the wedding vows she had made so happily 24 years earlier when she promised to be faithful to her husband no matter what. Even now, after so many years that the affair felt almost as normal as her marriage, when Susan actually thought about what she was doing, she still felt shocked that these were the choices she had made. And when she said it all out loud to herself, "I am cheating on my husband, I am having an affair, Jeff does not deserve this," she knew absolutely that what she was doing was wrong. And yet, she had not stopped. She meant to stop. Every day she meant to stop. But armed with that good intention, telling herself that every meeting and every call with her lover would definitely be the last, the affair had just dragged on. And over time, Susan had told herself that the excitement and attention she got from outside her marriage actually made it possible for her to stay in her marriage. It somehow made up for the lack of emotional connection she felt she had with Jeff, and the fact that she and Jeff worked opposite schedules. She worked days, he worked nights, although that too was Susan's fault. But now, word had gotten around Poughkeepsie Town Hall that Susan was stepping out on Jeff, and worst of all, Jeff himself had recently confronted her affair partner, and despite her lover's denials, and Susan's own denials, her pretend outrage had sounded false and hollow, even to her. Just 10 minutes after driving out of the parking lot of the Pleasant Valley United Methodist Church, Susan had arrived home. As she turned away from her car and started walking through the thick carpet of fallen leaves, she noted how the outside of the cranberry red house that she shared with Jeff looked as neglected and in need of maintenance as their own marriage. A moment later, standing at the front door, Susan steeled herself, arranging her features into an expression that appeared refreshed and relaxed, the way she wanted to feel after going to church. Then she opened the door, put down her coat and purse in the hallway, and then stepped into the living room to say what would sound like a cheery hello to Jeff. But instantly, before they had even exchanged a single word, Susan could feel the tension that hung between them, and even without seeing his face, she could sense Jeff's hurt and distrust. And lately, there had been something else in Jeff's expression too. Something hard and knowing in how Jeff looked at her, the way he turned away from her in mild disgust. Just for a moment, as Susan hovered on the threshold of the room where her husband sat waiting for her, Susan wondered how other people in Pleasant Valley saw her. She knew that from the outside at least, she seemed like the last person who would be having an affair, let alone an affair that had grown as complicated as this one had somehow become. To friends and family, Susan was the quintessential mom, wife, and working woman. She was a college-educated professional who was up early in the morning and busy most nights until she went to bed. An attractive woman with curly white blonde hair, oversized glasses, a tiny but somehow appealing overbite, and a solid build, Susan mostly stood out as someone who was always willing to help other people, whether it was through her various community and church activities or in response to a direct request, even if that request came from a total stranger. In fact, except for her height, Susan was over 6 feet tall, Susan knew there was nothing about her that seemed at all out of the ordinary. At work, she was competent, well-liked, and respected, and outside of work, her daily routines seemed as transparent and predictable as her ready smile and generally upbeat attitude. On Monday nights, she attended a jazzercise class at Pleasant Valley's Jewish Community Center. On Thursday evenings, Susan attended choir practice, and on Sundays, she attended church service and helped fill the worship space with the music she loved. If Susan had any guilty pleasures at all, it was probably her devotion to the daily TV soap opera Days of Our Lives, a melodrama that she made sure to record so she could watch it every night after all her chores were done. And as soon as she hit play, she could lose herself in the stories of beautiful people whose relationships, friendships, families, marriages, and work lives were in a constant state of turmoil, like her own had so recently and secretly become. Even at home, Jeff was the only person who seemed to have any inkling of Susan's affair. Her sons, Jason and Christopher, both knew her as a loving mom who was easy to talk with and confide in, that unusual person who would listen rather than pass judgment. And Susan knew that all those traits that made her approachable and kind seemed to have been handed down to her directly from her own mother, or maybe just learned from both her parents ever since she was a child growing up on a farm 30 miles to the south in the rural town of Pauling. Susan's father, a farmer, and Susan's mother, a schoolteacher, had met in church, and while their first house had just 4 rooms, Susan and her only other sibling, a sister who was 7 years older than Susan, had always enjoyed the love and attention of their parents. And after Susan's older sister had left the farm to go to nursing school and later to settle in Connecticut, Susan also started dreaming of bigger and better things, of becoming a teacher 30 miles and a world away in the big city of nearby Poughkeepsie, population 30,000. So, after graduating from college, Susan had packed her bags, and armed with her ambitions, she had left home and headed south. But instead of becoming a teacher, she landed a job in Poughkeepsie Town Hall, where eventually, as personnel director, she would be responsible for all the activities related to hiring city employees and working out their job descriptions and benefits. And it wasn't long after her arrival in Poughkeepsie that Susan had met her future husband, Jeff Fassett, at a local bar. Like Susan, Jeff was also starting his professional career. Jeff had been born in Poughkeepsie, and after attending military college in Pennsylvania, he had returned to his hometown and joined the Poughkeepsie Police Department. A quiet, generous, and dependable man with a quick laugh, Jeff had immediately been drawn to Susan's bubbly personality, sparkling blue eyes, and a playful streak that made her fun to be around. And when Jeff and Susan, so tall in her wedding dress and heels that she could look squarely into Jeff's eyes, promised to, quote, hold from this day forward for better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish until parted by death, end quote, she had meant every word of those vows. But by late afternoon on that bright Sunday, those early days of her marriage seemed so remote, Susan wondered if they had ever existed at all. Still, when she again walked into the living room, this time to ask Jeff what he would like for dinner, the finality of his simple, harsh statement to her came as a shock. Jeff looked up at Susan. "You're busted," he told her in a quiet voice. Then he turned away before saying, "Go, get out." Susan's smile slipped from her face, but before she could offer any excuses or explanations, Jeff told her that he didn't need her confession to know that she'd been having an affair. He was a cop after all. He'd seen the signs and had his suspicions now for months, maybe even years, but until now he'd never confronted her, and he'd never looked for proof. In fact, he had hoped that if Susan was cheating, she'd get it out of her system and come back to him, and they'd never even have to talk about it. But when that didn't happen, and the rumors at town hall were too loud and persistent to ignore, Jeff had recently attached a recording device to the Facets' home telephone. And sure enough, he'd heard a phone call his wife had made that left no doubt in his mind that she was not just having sex with someone else, but his wife was deeply involved with someone else. For the time being, get out meant that Susan would take what she needed for the next several days from their master bedroom and move into the small apartment, once intended for Jeff's elderly mother, that Jeff had built in a separate part of the house. That night, Susan lay awake in the narrow, empty bed. As she stared up at the ceiling, she thought about her life with Jeff, about all that they had done and made together, about their 2 children, and about the pleasure that both of them used to feel when they were together. It was as though someone had pulled a blindfold off of her eyes. There was suddenly no question in Susan's mind that even though her marriage was horribly damaged as a result of things she herself had done, it was worth infinitely more to her than continuing her affair. As she laid there, she wondered if there was still hope for her and Jeff. And at around midnight, as the clock clicked over to September 20th, 1999, the 24th anniversary of their marriage, Susan turned on the bedside light, then swung her long legs over the edge of the bed and stood up. Slipping on her glasses and pulling her robe tightly around her, Susan stepped to the bag she had packed that afternoon and began rummaging through her belongings. When she found the things she was looking for, she held both items tightly in her hands for a second or two before sliding them into her pocket. Straightening up, she took a deep breath, then left the little apartment and made her way to the bedroom she had so recently shared with Jeff. Once inside, she stood next to the bed and looked at her husband. "Jeff," she whispered, waking him up from a light and troubled sleep. "Would you consider reconciling?" she asked him. And then Susan reached into her pocket and took out the items she had grabbed a few minutes earlier, a cell phone and a pager she had been using to contact her lover. "Here," Susan told Jeff, handing him the 2 devices. "No more," Susan said. "I promise, it's over." A few days later, the Facets' older son, Jason, walked into their house and saw his mom and dad cuddling together on the couch. He'd known that his parents were considering the possibility of splitting up, so he was visibly surprised. When his parents noticed the strange look on his face, Jeff and Susan smiled. "We decided to stay together and try to work things out," Susan told their son. And over the next month, starting with Susan and Jeff both taking a week off work and spending every minute together, it seemed to the Facets' sons that their parents had in fact fallen back in love. Jeff and Susan had even decided to buy new wedding bands and renew their marriage vows, and both Jeff and Susan had started working together on some badly needed home improvement projects that they had been putting off for years. On Thursday, October 28th, about 5 weeks after Jeff and Susan had made the decision to reconcile, Jeff stopped by his wife's office in Poughkeepsie Town Hall. He had just picked up his new wedding band, and he wanted to show Susan how it looked. Smiling up at Jeff, Susan touched her finger to the bright, unscratched gold and agreed that the new band was perfect. Then she told her husband she'd try to be home a little early that evening so they could have a family dinner together with Jason and Christopher and the boys' girlfriends before Susan had to leave for her 7 p.m. choir practice. Throughout dinner that evening, Jeff kept stealing glances at the new gold band on his ring finger. To him, Susan's breaded chicken and green beans had never tasted so good. Now that the 2 of them had talked things out, everything about his life, from simple meals to putting on his uniform each night and heading to work in the dark, seemed a million times better. Before leaving the house for choir practice, Susan smiled as Jeff gave her a kiss and thanked her for preparing dinner. He told her he'd look forward to seeing her when she got back. Then Susan stepped outside and walked to her car. Climbing inside the Jeep, she made the short drive from her home to the big white Methodist church located at 99 Martin Road. As Susan expected, the small lot next to the church was full. After all, with Thanksgiving and Christmas fast approaching, this was a season of music when every member of the choir showed up for their 90-minute practice. But after parking in the second lot across the street, Susan did not immediately get out of her car and head across Martin Street for the church. Instead, she sat for a moment inside the quiet Jeep and thought about the pager that she had not given to Jeff back on the night of October 19th when he had confronted her about her affair. Now, as she looked up at the simple white steeple and cross lit by the church floodlights, she considered the 5 calls she had made to her lover earlier that day. And all at once, Susan could feel her chest tighten with fear. She knew that there was just so much that any husband could forgive, and there were still things Jeff didn't know, things she could not let him know, things that made it very hard for Susan to do what she absolutely needed to do: end this affair. She thought back to the incident that had happened just as she and her family were finishing dinner that night. Jeff had glanced out the window and thought he had seen someone skulking in the shadows of the driveway. His cop senses always on high alert, he'd stepped out onto the back porch for a closer look, but whoever it was, if in fact there had been anyone there at all, had melted away into the darkness. Susan gave a tiny shake and told herself to stop being ridiculous. Her lover had not been happy when she told him she wanted to end the affair, and he had demanded one more recent sexual encounter. But that was done now, and she wanted to believe that they had parted on good terms and that her lover would not do anything to hurt her or her family. And so, if there really had been a person in the driveway, Susan told herself that it was probably just someone who had gotten lost, and maybe they were thinking about asking for directions but thought better of it. And with that, Susan gathered her purse and coat, left the Jeep locked in the parking lot, and headed to the Pleasant Valley United Methodist Church. An hour and a half later, at 8:36 p.m., Susan was stepping out of the church surrounded by friends, all of them chatting as they groped in pockets and purses for car keys before fanning out in different directions as they headed for the two different parking lots. For just 90 minutes, in the joy of singing, Susan had been able to forget all of her worries and guilt. And now, as she said goodbye to other choir members and made the short walk across Martin Street to her gold Jeep, parked under an overhead light in the far lot, Susan felt a rare sense of inner peace. Humming a few bars of music from the new arrangement the choir would sing this coming Sunday, Susan failed to notice that a car she didn't recognize was parked right alongside her own in the church lot. It certainly did not belong to any of the members of church choir, whose cars had become as familiar as the sound of each member's voice. Instead, without so much as a glance at the car or the person who sat inside, Susan stepped to the driver's side of her Jeep, unlocked the door, and climbed behind the wheel. Closing the car door, Susan put the key in the ignition, turned on the car and headlights, then reached up to her left to pull the seatbelt down across her lap. A moment later, the cold, clear night outside the Pleasant Valley United Methodist Church was shattered by the sound of 6 gunshots, and then the kick of gravel as the car that had been parked next to Susan's peeled out of the church lot and was almost immediately swallowed up by the thin ribbon of traffic along Route 72 out of town. Within moments of the shots, members of the church choir were either pulling out their cell phones or darting back into the church to call 911. At the same time, a few others headed for the far lot where the gunshots had come from, and where at least one person saw an older model light-colored station wagon speeding to the parking lot exit. By the time the first ambulance had arrived at the United Methodist Church, one of Susan's friends was sitting hunched over on the ground next to Susan's car, their arms cradling Susan's head and shoulders. When the first bullet had shattered the driver's side window of the gold Jeep Cherokee, Susan, her seatbelt not yet securely fastened, must have reached instinctively for her car door so she could jump down and try to escape the attack. Instead, when the door opened, Susan had tumbled out, and by the time her friend had reached her, Susan was slumped against the side of her car, her neck dark with blood, but still alive. Even as the ambulance carrying Susan had raced off to St. Francis Hospital in Poughkeepsie, the lead detective in the case was already on his way to the crime scene. Arthur Boyko, a lieutenant with the New York State Police, had been notified of a shooting and possible dead body at the United Methodist Church parking lot in Pleasant Valley. Detective Boyko knew exactly where that church was located. Assigned to the Bureau of Criminal Investigation, he worked with Troop K in a barracks located at the edge of Pleasant Valley, fewer than 5 miles from the church. By the time Detective Boyko arrived at the church, local police had secured the scene with yellow crime scene tape and were doing their best to keep potential witnesses separate from the growing crowd of onlookers. Tall, lean, and commanding with his thin face and military-style haircut, the 34-year-old detective immediately took charge of the situation. And right away, he knew that this investigation would be very, very complicated. Because in the same breath that choir members gave first responders the name of the victim, Susan Fassett, they also told officers that Susan's husband was a cop, a lieutenant with the Poughkeepsie Police Department. Even before forming any first impressions of the crime scene, investigator Boyko knew that most murders and attempted homicides are committed by people close to the victim. And that made Jeff Fassett an immediate person of interest, especially since, as a police officer, Jeff had a gun, a service weapon that had to be secured and tested as soon as possible. At the same time, the detective also needed to make sure that Jeff and his sons were informed of the attack on Susan. And if Susan was still alive, her family deserved the chance to visit her right away at the hospital. The decision about whether to question Jeff as a suspect or just inform him of the attack on Susan and let him go see her was made for the investigator when one of the witnesses to the shooting said that the car that had been parked next to Susan's belonged to Jeff Fassett. Operating on the assumption that Jeff was armed and dangerous and may even try to harm other family members who might be inside the house with him, police immediately organized a Special Weapons and Tactics Team, or SWAT team, to surround the Fassett house and take Jeff and anyone else inside the house into police custody. Meanwhile, back at the crime scene, Detective Boyko had assigned officers to carry out interviews with eyewitnesses, along with Susan's friends, neighbors, and co-workers at Poughkeepsie Town Hall. In making a close survey of the scene and hearing initial eyewitness accounts, the detective had also arrived at several important conclusions. As crime scene techs collected and photographed evidence and dusted for fingerprints, Detective Boyko had decided that this was not some random attack or attempted robbery. No one had taken Susan's personal belongings, including her purse, which were still in plain sight on the front passenger seat, and whoever had attacked Susan must have been lying in wait for her, which suggested that not only was Susan the specific target of the attack, but that her would-be killer knew something about Susan's routines and expected that Susan would be at that church that night for choir practice. But the pattern of gunfire also made it unlikely that this was an execution-style hit. Not only did Susan seem like a very unlikely target for that, first responders had also reported that none of the bullets were clustered around Susan's head like you would expect in an execution-style hit. Instead, her attacker had fired a spray of bullets, including one that had missed its mark completely and instead lodged in the doorframe of Susan's car. By the time police had Jeff, his two sons, and their girlfriends lying face down and handcuffed on the gravel driveway outside of the Fassett home, it was 11 p.m. and Susan had already died of her injuries. And for the next 16 hours, police interrogated Jeff about his wife's murder, even as his sons sat handcuffed to separate desks inside the local police station. All Jeff and the boys had been able to find out during a tense 2-hour standoff with the SWAT team that had surrounded their house was that Susan had been shot at the United Methodist Church. Although Jeff declared his innocence and answered every question in a calm, neutral voice, he had been a cop long enough to know that things looked very bad for him. While Susan was at choir practice, he had left his house and driven to Poughkeepsie to get his paycheck. So not only had an eyewitness ID'd Jeff's car as the one leaving the scene of the crime, Jeff also had no alibi for the time of the murder. And police had discovered that Jeff had a very strong motive for this murder. If Susan thought she had kept her affair a secret from those around her, she was mistaken. In no time, neighbors and co-workers had reported to police that Susan Fassett was having an affair. Not only that, but as Jeff told police, just weeks earlier, he had confronted Susan's affair partner with his suspicions right in the middle of Jeff's office inside the Poughkeepsie Police Department. But throughout that long night of questioning, Jeff never wavered from his absolute insistence that he had nothing to do with his wife's brutal murder. And he also never wavered from telling police that if they wanted to find his wife's killer, they should go talk with the man she'd been seeing outside of their marriage. "You can turn on the hot lights," Jeff told the lie detector expert from the State Bureau of Criminal Investigation. "Beat me with rubber hoses. But when you're all done with me and you get me out of the way, you go see Fred Andros. He did this. He's involved in this." The identity of Susan's affair partner and his possible involvement in her murder sent shockwaves through every level of the investigation, even making its way into the regional offices of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI. It also sent shockwaves through Poughkeepsie Town Hall, where Fred Andrus had worked, until recently, as the head of the town's water department. Because Fred Andrus's name was already widely and publicly linked to serious criminal activity. Back in May of 1999, just 5 months before Susan's murder, Fred had been forced to resign his job as water superintendent after he was caught collecting bribes for a man named William Paroli. the most powerful political operative in the Poughkeepsie Republican Party. And one day after Fred resigned, he pled guilty to corruption charges and struck a deal with the FBI. In exchange for a lesser sentence, Fred had agreed to testify against William Paroli, who was charged with running a widespread shakedown operation of local contractors for the previous 6 years. And not only was Fred Andrus a known thief and liar, he was also a well-known womanizer. Despite his bullet-shaped head, small facial features, and Elvis-like pompadour all stacked on top of his 5'7" overweight body, Fred was on his 4th marriage, a fact that did not stop him from regularly soliciting the services of Poughkeepsie area prostitutes. The connection between Fred and Susan, confirmed by Jeff, opened the door to all kinds of new leads in the investigation. If it wasn't Jeff who killed his wife in a jealous rage, was it Fred? Was it Fred's wife? If Fred was involved with multiple women, could one of them have viewed Susan as a rival and decided to kill her? Or did Susan, because of her close association with Fred, know something about the ongoing corruption probe that made her a target of assassination? By 4 a.m. on the morning of October 29th, while Jeff was still being questioned at the Pleasant Valley Police Station, investigator Boyko was sitting across the table from Fred inside Fred's comfortable 3-story home located in a nice part of Poughkeepsie called Hyde Park. And within minutes of talking to Fred, the detective was aware that Fred, despite his less-than-handsome appearance, possessed a certain charm and confidence. He also had an airtight alibi for the evening of Susan's murder. From 7 to 9 p.m. the previous night, Fred and his wife had spent the evening with friends, a retired Poughkeepsie police officer and his wife. The men had spent most of the evening down in Fred's basement building very sophisticated model airplanes, which was a hobby the two friends shared. As for his relationship with Susan, Fred would confirm that he had been having a 4-year-long affair with Susan, and that they had actually known each other for 16 years before that. Fred also confirmed that Susan had wanted to end their affair after her confrontation with her husband Jeff back in mid-September, but Fred insisted that it had been a mutual decision to end the affair. And when the two of them had broken it off back in September, Fred had made a full confession to his own wife, who had been generous enough to forgive him. When asked when he had last seen or had a sexual encounter with Susan, Fred disclosed that he was actually impotent and that the physical part of his relationship with Susan consisted of cuddling and kissing and companionship. According to Fred, the last time he and Susan had actually had sexual intercourse was 1.5 years ago. Although Fred was obviously distressed by the news that Susan was dead, the only subject that seemed to make the disgraced town official nervous was whether the murder could have anything to do with the ongoing corruption probe at Poughkeepsie Town Hall. Fred admitted that now that he was a witness for the FBI, he felt like he could be in danger from local bad guys. And Fred also admitted that it was possible Susan could have been in danger just because of him. Contrary to what Detective Boyko heard, that Susan's affair with Fred seemed to be public knowledge, Fred insisted that he and Susan had kept their relationship a very closely guarded secret. It seemed like a small discrepancy, but one that the investigator knew he would have to follow up on. Meanwhile, detectives also began to collect all of the communication data, telephone, pager, cell phone, and email that belonged to the key figures in the case, including Susan, Fred, and Jeff. With the help of technology experts, investigators hoped to compile a picture of who was where and who was talking to whom in the days and weeks leading up to Susan's murder. The first break in the case came on October 30th, 2 days after Susan's murder. Partial results from Susan's autopsy had revealed traces of semen inside of Susan, meaning she must have had intercourse between 24 and 48 hours before she had died. Hours later, Jeff was brought back to the police station where he told detectives that the last time he and Susan had made love was 4 or 5 days before she was killed. An analysis of the blood sample Jeff gave police, along with the results of a lie detector test he also agreed to take, confirmed Jeff's story. And after seeing pictures of Jeff's car, the woman who had placed his car in the church parking lot on the night of the murder also told police that she actually might have been mistaken. It might have been a different car. While police were still not willing to rule Jeff out as a suspect, they now knew that they had to find the man who had had sex with Susan within 2 days of her murder. Unfortunately, the problem with this new piece of physical evidence was that police simply had no other suspects aside from Jeff against whom they could match the semen sample. So, even though police had ruled Fred Andros out as the murderer, Detective Boyko decided it was still worth following up with him, as well as with Jeff, to see if either man could shed additional light on what was happening in Susan's life or in her past that might provide any clues to her murder. Because Fred had a solid alibi for the time of the murder, and police had no evidence that linked him to the crime, there was no legal way to compel Fred to give them a DNA sample so they could rule him out as the mystery man who last had sex with Susan Fassett. But when Fred declined the investigators' request for such a sample, there was nothing to prevent Investigator Boyko from inviting Fred to have lunch with him in a public place, and then for the detective to collect a DNA sample by pocketing the straw that Fred had used to sip from his cup of water. Besides, after hearing rumors that Fred regularly solicited sex from prostitutes, investigators had to wonder if Fred had been lying when he told them he was unable to have sex. But it wasn't until mid-December, 1.5 months after Susan was gunned down, that Detective Boyko and the Bureau of Criminal Investigation would get the tip they needed to break the murder case wide open. And the story that investigators ultimately pieced together would make Susan's favorite soap opera, Days of Our Lives, look like a happy fairy tale written for kids. Based on what investigators discovered, here is a reconstruction of what happened on the night of Thursday, October 28th, when Susan left the United Methodist Church in Pleasant Valley and hummed her way across the parking lot to her brand new gold Jeep Cherokee. As soon as the killer arrived at the church, they saw that their timing was perfect. Susan's distinctive Jeep was parked in the lot farther away from the church, and there were several empty slots on either side of the Jeep. A moment later, the killer had backed the old Taurus station wagon with the fake license plates into the empty space next to the Jeep. Now, the front passenger seat of the Taurus was directly across from the driver's side of the Jeep. As the killer hoisted their bulky frame from the driver's side into the passenger seat, they put the passenger side seat back all the way so anyone looking at the Taurus would think the car was empty. Reclining in the dark, the killer tried to slow their racing heart. Earlier that evening, the killer had actually gone directly to Susan's house to see if they could get a clean shot at her while she was eating dinner with her family, or if she stepped outside alone onto the back porch. But the killer had barely made it halfway up the driveway before Susan's husband had suddenly come out the back door and begun to make a slow circuit of the house while calling out if anyone was out there. That had been even worse than what had happened 4 days earlier, on Monday, October 25th, when the killer had driven to the Pleasant Valley Jewish Community Center, intending to kill Susan there, but the center had been too crowded and Susan's car wasn't there, so the killer had just left. But now there was no turning back. It had been made very clear to the killer that Susan was not dead by the end of tonight, that very bad things would happen to the killer's own family. Closing their eyes in the dark, the killer could see the photographs spread out on the kitchen table in front of them. The killer's son, each sibling, each aunt, each stepchild, all pictured alone, all vulnerable to some terrible accident, including murder. It would be a shame if anything happened to them, the person sitting across the table had said in that low monotone that had somehow always sounded so threatening and dangerous. The choice was clear: Susan or the killer's own loved ones. And at 4 p.m. that afternoon, the killer was driving away from their home in the Catskill Mountains, 1 hour south to Pleasant Valley. Along the way, the killer stopped at a local Kmart near the Fassett home and bought shoes, a t-shirt, a black full-face ski mask, and a bottle of pain pills for the headache that now never seemed to go away. A little further on, the killer pulled into a Dunkin' Donuts coffee shop and bought 24 donuts and then crammed them one after the other into their mouth. There had been an added incentive: get rid of Susan, and the killer would not have to pay back that loan, which now totaled over $10,000. Yes, the decision to go directly to Susan's house had been stupid, but there was no harm done. And now the killer was perfectly placed to make the kill and then forget that any of this had ever happened. The reason Susan had to die was so she could never testify in court about the corruption case. But sitting here now, the killer decided that for the person who had set this plot in motion, the real motive here was revenge. A moment later, the killer checked their watch and then reached over to the .45 caliber Ruger on the seat next to them. It was almost time. And sure enough, just after 8:30 p.m., the killer could see the doors of the church open, and in the light that spilled out, the killer had no trouble recognizing Susan's tall figure and white blonde curls. After exchanging goodbyes with other members of the choir, Susan stepped out from the group and started making her way across Martin Street toward the second parking lot. The killer stared at Susan in fascination. They had only been together 5 times, but the killer knew every inch of those long legs and feel of Susan's solid hips, back, chest, arms, and mouth. But aside from knowing Susan's body, the killer felt no connection to the woman they were about to kill. It wasn't like they had ever been in a relationship with one another. A minute later, and Susan had walked to the driver's side of her Jeep, opened the door, and tossed her purse onto the passenger seat. The killer lay back, still reclining, until Susan had climbed into the Jeep and started the engine. Then, sitting up, the killer leveled the gun at Susan and started pulling the trigger. The first shot shattered the window on the driver's side of the Jeep. That same bullet also passed directly through Susan's neck, hitting 2 major arteries. As Susan opened her door and tumbled out of the car, the killer shot 5 more rounds. 4 of those bullets would lodge into Susan's body. The 5th would lodge into the driver's side doorframe of her Jeep. 2 of the shots were fatal. Even as medics would later rush Susan to the hospital, she was already dying, and there was nothing anyone could have done to save her. As soon as the gun was empty, the killer shifted back into the driver's seat and took off out of the church parking lot. On their way home, the killer dropped off the garbage bag containing the gun, gloves, and ski mask at the prearranged location alongside of a nearby road. Then, Susan's sexual partner, a 50-year-old woman named Dawn Silvernail, stopped outside of a convenience store in Hyde Park, Poughkeepsie. Before heading back to her house and husband up in the Catskills, Dawn called her other sexual partner, Fred Andrus, on his pager. As soon as the device connected, Dawn carefully typed in the numbers 666, the agreed-upon code that would let Fred know that Susan Fassett, the 3rd member of their sexual threesome, and the woman who had dared to leave him, was now dead. It would turn out that it was Fred who had planned and orchestrated Susan's murder by coercing another one of his lovers to kill Susan. But it wasn't until mid-December that Fred revealed the name of the woman who had actually fired the shots that killed Susan. That was when an analysis of the DNA from Fred's drinking straw confirmed that Fred was the mystery man who had had sex with Susan within 2 days of her murder. By the time Jeff Fassett had confronted his wife back in mid-September with proof that he knew about her affair with Fred Andrus, Susan already knew that when it came to Fred, she was in way over her head. What had started as an affair 4 years earlier had become a relationship that Fred used to play out his own sexual fantasies. He made that easier for himself by getting Jeff Fassett moved to an overnight shift so Fred would have better access to Susan. In addition to Fred's relationship with Susan, he had also been involved with a woman named Dawn Silvernail. The two had first met back in 1977 over Citizens Band Radio, where Fred went by the name Neptune and Dawn went by the name Footloose. After meeting in person a year later, the two began a sexual relationship that would continue on and off for more than 20 years, during which time Fred would marry and divorce multiple times, and Dawn would marry and settle in the Catskill Mountains in upstate New York. Over the years, Fred had loaned Dawn about $15,000, which Dawn started paying back by performing sex acts for Fred, including having sex with Fred's friends and acquaintances. And by the summer of 1999, Fred had developed a taste for watching two women have sex with each other and then joining in to make it a threesome. It was then that Fred started recruiting and paying Dawn to have sex with Susan. The encounters would usually take place on the concrete floor of one of Poughkeepsie's several water pumping stations, except for the first encounter, which Fred staged in his own basement and which he videotaped from start to finish. After Susan ended her affair with Fred in mid-September, Susan's family believes that Fred, enraged by the rejection, may have threatened either to harm Susan's family or to reveal the contents of that sex tape unless she continued to see him. Once Fred was confronted in mid-December by investigators who now had proof that Fred had been lying to them all along about his involvement with Susan, Fred tried to save himself by pointing the finger at Dawn and insisting that Susan's death was the result of a lover's quarrel between the two women. But when interrogated by police, Dawn eventually laid out every detail of the murder plot devised by Fred Andrus and handed over to police the gun she had used to kill Susan. And Dawn's story would be backed up by an analysis of phone and pager records belonging to Fred, Dawn, and Susan. The data showed that Dawn had called and talked with Fred several times on the day of Susan's murder, and that Dawn had paged Fred from the convenience store near his home shortly after she had committed the murder. According to Dawn, Fred had insisted that Susan had to die so she could never testify against him in court about his involvement in the Poughkeepsie corruption scandal, except that federal agents insisted that Susan had no involvement in that corruption probe and no information that could affect the case one way or another. But before police could arrest Fred, there would be one more unbelievable twist to this bizarre and tragic crime. On December 30th, 1999, 2 months after Susan's murder, police were inside the Andrus house executing a search warrant when they heard a single gunshot up in the attic. Realizing that he would be prosecuted for murder, Fred had attempted suicide by holding a gun to his chin and pulling the trigger. But instead of traveling up into his brain, the bullet glanced off the bone in Fred's jaw, and instead of killing him, it blew away the lower part of his face. Fred would survive the self-inflicted injury, and on February 23, 2001, he was found guilty of second-degree murder and conspiracy in the first degree in the death of Susan Fassett. The two charges would carry a combined prison sentence of 50 years to life. On March 16, 2001, Dawn Silvernail, who had accepted a guilty plea in exchange for testifying against Fred Andrus, was sentenced to 18 years to life for killing Susan Fassett. 1 year and 9 months into his prison sentence, at the age of 63, Fred Andrus died of an apparent heart attack at the Clinton Correctional Center in New York. Dawn Silvernail was released from prison after serving 16 years. She died 3 years later at the age of 70. Susan's husband, Jeff Fassett, remarried 5 years after Susan's death, and 2 years later retired from the Poughkeepsie Police Department. Jeff would die of cancer in 2018 at the age of 67. Pelican Valley is a beautiful, remote section of backcountry in Yellowstone National Park in Wyoming. Its meandering meadows and creeks and 360-degree view of the mountains make it appear like the perfect place to camp out under the stars. But unlike other areas of the park, Pelican Valley requires a special permit if you intend to stay the night. And before Yellowstone Park rangers give you this permit, they remind you that Pelican Valley is a very dangerous place, and in general, you should only be out there with groups of at least 4 people. On July 28, 1984, 25-year-old Brigitte Fredenhagen, along with her brother Andreas and her sister-in-law Janko, arrived at Yellowstone National Park. That night, they stayed in one of the park's more established campgrounds called Grant Village. The following day, they headed out to one of the park's famous hot springs called the Norris Geyser. That afternoon, before heading back to their campsite, they made a pit stop at the park ranger's office so Brigitte could apply for a Pelican Valley permit. Her plan was to spend the following night in the valley. When they went in the office, the rangers believed all 3 of them were applying for a permit, and so they weren't asking that many questions. They were just kind of going through the routine. And then when Brigitte said, no, it's just going to be me applying for a permit, they actually immediately tried to dissuade her and said, this is a really bad idea. Nobody goes into Pelican Valley on their own. But Brigitte assured them that she was an experienced camper, she understood the risks, and she still wanted to go on her own. And Andreas and Janko, who were standing behind her, kind of echoed that sentiment and said, no, she's really good. She knows what she's doing. The park rangers were not thrilled with her plan, but they ultimately decided, you know what, if she wants to go, she can go. They just asked her to show them on a map where she intended to camp, so if they needed to, they could come and check on her and make sure she was okay. And so she pointed to a section on the map, and they handed her her permit, and then she, along with Andreas and Janko, left the office and headed back to their campsite. The next morning, the trio got up early and they hopped in the car and drove to the Pelican Valley trailhead. They parked their car, they got out, and they began walking into Pelican Valley as a group. After a few miles, as planned, the group stopped, at which point Andreas told Brigitte that they were going to head back now and that they would meet her tomorrow at the trailhead where they parked the car. They said their goodbyes, and then Andreas and Janko turned around and started walking back towards the car, and Brigitte carried on into the wilderness. The following day, Andreas and Janko arrived at the trailhead to meet Brigitte, but she didn't show up. And after a couple of hours, they grew very concerned, so they called park rangers and asked them, have you seen Brigitte? And they said no, but we'll go take a look. The area Brigitte had told park rangers she was going to be camping was inside of a densely forested area right next to a large meadow, which meant as park rangers came up to check on her, they would not actually be able to see her until they were practically right on top of her. So the park rangers made their way through the meadow and into the forest before they started yelling for Brigitte, but she didn't yell back, and then at some point they reached the area where she had said she was camping, and sure enough they found her tent. But it was a very odd scene. When they came up to the tent, they could see there was a big tear in one side. When they poked their heads down and looked inside, all of her belongings in the tent were undisturbed. There was a foam sleeping mat right in the middle, and then to the right of the mat was a flashlight that had been turned off. On the left side of the pad was a tape player with headphones that she must have been listening to before bed. It had been left on until the batteries ran out. At the foot of the pad was her backpack, inside of which were all of her clothes that had been neatly packed inside of Ziploc bags to mask her scent. Also in the pack was a wilderness survival guide with a page flipped down that was a diagram of how to string your food up into the trees so no animals can get to it. The rangers looked around the backside of the tent about 2 meters away, and they found her sleeping bag perfectly flat on the ground as if it had been laid out to dry in the sun. But upon closer inspection, they found it had 2 puncture marks, one that was up near the neck of the bag and the other that was near the torso, but there was no blood on the bag. At this point, rangers started to speculate that this could have been an animal attack, but they were confused at the general tidiness of the scene. Typically, when an animal attacks a person, it looks like a bomb went off in the area where the attack occurred, and this campsite was very, very neat. As the rangers continued to walk around the campsite looking for clues and yelling out for Brigitte, they found a barely discernible drag tail a couple of meters away from the sleeping bag that was leading west into the forest and up a hill. And so the rangers started following this trail, and they got about 20 meters away from the camp when they discovered Brigitte's cooler lying on the ground on its side, and whatever food had been in there was now gone. There was some string laying next to it, so it looked like it had been strung up in the trees, but someone or something had gotten it down. From the cooler, the rangers continue walking along this drag trail another 20 meters or so up a hill, where they discover a woman's sweater on the ground that's been torn up and there's blood on it. So at this point, the rangers get their rifles up and they keep walking another 40 meters up and over the hill down into this clearing in the woods where they find Brigitte, or what was left of her. No one knows exactly what happened to Brigitte, but the theory based on physical evidence is this. After setting up her campsite, Brigitte climbed inside of her tent, got inside of her sleeping bag, and then put her headphones on to listen to music. A little while later, a male grizzly bear discovered Brigitte's cooler strung up in the trees about 20 meters away. And apparently, Brigitte did not string it high enough because the bear was able to reach up and pull it down. After the bear ate the food inside of the cooler, it was still hungry, so it began looking around the area for more to eat. It's believed this bear was so accustomed to human traffic in the area that when he stumbled across Brigitte's tent, he wasn't scared. In fact, he thought, there's food inside of there. There's people I can eat. So this bear quietly lumbers over to the side of the tent, it reaches up and cuts the nylon with its paw, then it puts its head inside and bites down on Brigitte's skull and begins dragging her away. There was no sign of a struggle in or near the tent, indicating that Brigitte was most likely asleep, or maybe she just could not hear the bear because she still had her headphones in. She was dragged 80 meters by her skull to that clearing where she was consumed. An attack like this is exactly the reason why Pelican Bay is considered so dangerous, because it's full of grizzly bears. And even though grizzly attacks on humans are incredibly rare, most people do not understand just how horrific they are when they do occur. Grizzly bears don't really try to kill their prey before they eat them. Instead, they focus on pinning them down and then getting them under their body weight so they can't go anywhere, at which point they can eat them at a leisurely pace. Some say grizzlies actually prefer to eat their prey while they're still living, which is why so often in grizzly attacks you see the arms and legs eaten first and then the head and torso. This is a method that keeps the victim alive a little bit longer. Unfortunately, there was so little left of Brigitte that investigators could not pinpoint a time of death. However, because this bear broke normal behavior and intentionally targeted a human, there's a good chance he savored that meal. The next and final story of today's episode is called Blood on the Mountain. On the afternoon of May 6th, 2008, a 54-year-old man called Ricky Williams stood on the riverbank casting out his line into the waters of Dismal Creek in western Virginia. Ricky was hoping to get lucky and catch some trout, but he'd been out here fishing for 30 minutes so far, and there were no bites. Normally, Ricky wouldn't care, because he loved just fishing for hours and hours at a time. But today, he and his dog, who was right with him, were really hungry, because they'd been out in these woods camping for several weeks now, and their food supply was finally dwindling down to the end. And so if they didn't catch any fish today, they might not eat. Now, for context, where Ricky was fishing, Dismal Creek, despite its bleak name, it was actually a beautiful, secluded spot on top of a mountain that was on the Appalachian Trail. The Appalachian Trail is a very famous 2,200-mile-long trail that runs up and down the east coast of the United States. And why that is relevant is because there's this special code for people that hike on the Appalachian Trail. And the code, which all hikers know, is basically if you come across another hiker on the Appalachian Trail, it is your responsibility to help them if they need help. And it is their responsibility to help you if you need help. So it's this community of hikers that are always looking to help each other. And so Ricky was very aware of this code on the Appalachian Trail, and he was secretly hoping, as he cast his line over and over again and didn't get any bites, that a hiker or a group of hikers might come by this area, and maybe they would see him and come down and learn that he needed food, and they might just give him some of their food. But another half hour passed and no hikers came by, and still Ricky could not catch any fish. But then suddenly, Ricky's dog, who was right next to him, began to whine and kind of began shifting around like it was sensing a predator in the area or something. But as Ricky was trying to calm his dog down, he began to hear a voice in the woods right behind him. Somebody was moving towards him. And when Ricky heard this voice, on the one hand, he was pretty excited because maybe this is a hiker who can give him some food. But on the other hand, Ricky couldn't help but feel really uneasy. Now, you need to understand that Ricky was an older guy, he was kind of frail, and over the past few weeks that he'd been camping with his dog, as his food supply had run down, he had become skinnier and skinnier and skinnier, and so he really did not pose any sort of threat to anybody. He's like this weak older man. Now, generally speaking, the Appalachian Trail was a very safe place. But over the last few decades, there had actually been several murders that took place on the Appalachian Trail. And in fact, one of those killings took place less than 2 miles away from where Ricky was fishing with his dog. And in that double homicide, a very well-known killer named Randall Lee Smith had stabbed and shot to death 2 hikers. And so while Ricky was really looking for help from fellow hikers, at the same time, he couldn't help but feel somewhat apprehensive. Because again, Ricky was like this small, frail guy, and Ricky was well aware of these murders, and he was well aware of the fact that he was super close to one of the murder sites. And so Ricky was totally on edge as he's listening to this male voice get closer and closer, and then finally, this man in his early 30s steps out from the tree line, and he looks over and he sees Ricky, and for a second, the 2 men just kind of look at each other, but then this guy just grinned at Ricky and said, "Hey, how you doing?" And immediately Ricky felt relieved because he could tell just from looking at this guy that very likely he was not a threat. The man introduced himself as Scott Johnston, and he told Ricky he was actually camping in the area with a friend of his, and they were out here fishing, just like Ricky. And Ricky pretty much immediately said, "Oh, great, nice to meet you. Do you have any food for me?" And Scott was like, "Absolutely." And he dug into his bag that he had with him, and he pulled out a couple energy bars and a bag of chips, and he threw them over to Ricky. And he also gave some fresh bait to Ricky, so he too could cast out again. And for the next couple of hours, Scott and Ricky just stood on the riverbank and fished together. And after a while, the trout did start biting, and they did start catching fish, so the day kind of turned into a great outing for Ricky. And it got even better because as soon as the men were done fishing, Scott asked Ricky if he wanted to join him and his friend back up at the campsite for dinner. And remember, Ricky had no food, so this was an amazing invitation, and he said, "Yes, of course, I'd love to join you." So the 2 men packed up their stuff right as the sun was going down, and then they began walking back into the forest where Scott had emerged from. And as they were walking, Scott's fishing pole got tangled on a low-hanging branch, and he was really struggling to get it out of the tree. And so finally, he just told Ricky to, go on ahead. My campsite's right up there. It's a straight shot. Just go up the hill and you'll see it. Ricky asked Scott if he was sure, and Scott said, no, it's totally fine, go ahead. So Ricky said, okay, and he walked the rest of the way up the hill, and then when he walked out of the tree line into the clearing where Scott's campsite was, immediately what Ricky noticed was this enormous man who was like twice the size of Scott, and so 4 times the size of Ricky, kind of hunched over the campfire. And this huge man, who presumably was Scott's friend, he heard Ricky walk into the circle, and remember, it's nighttime and they're kind of in the middle of nowhere, and so this guy, he turns his head around and sees this strange man just standing there, and Scott's nowhere to be found, and so this guy, he grabs a club, like a piece of wood, and he looks at Ricky kind of menacingly, like, what are you doing here? And Ricky, who was so caught off guard by just how big this guy was, he put his hands up and he said, I'm so sorry, Scott sent me up here. I don't know if this is the right site, I'm sorry. But just at that moment, Scott had finished untangling his fishing line, and he came out of the tree line, and he patted Ricky on the back, and he said, oh, you've already met my friend Sean. And as soon as he said that, Sean looked like he basically let his guard down. He put the wood down, and he stopped glaring directly at Ricky. But Ricky felt like Sean was not happy that Ricky was in his campsite, even though clearly Scott is the reason that Ricky is in this campsite. And so Ricky just felt really uncomfortable, and at the same time, Scott is ushering Ricky closer to the campfire to take a seat next to Sean. Sean's a great cook, he'll cook up this fish for us, it's gonna be great, take a seat. Ricky felt kind of annoyed that Scott was really forcing him to stay, but Ricky didn't want to be rude and just kind of abruptly leave, so he did take a seat next to Sean, who definitely was not excited to be sitting next to Ricky, and Ricky just kind of sat there waiting to see what would happen next. And what happened next is Scott walked over to Sean and handed off all the fish that he and Ricky had caught so that Sean could begin to prepare them to cook them. And then as Ricky is still just sitting there right next to Sean, Scott walked away from the campfire up to his truck, which was parked right next to Sean's Jeep. And Scott turned on the radio and began blasting country music. And when Ricky heard this music, he kind of winced because to him, part of the reason the outdoors, the Appalachian Trail, being out in nature, part of the reason it was so wonderful was for the peace and quiet. And so it felt kind of like borderline disrespectful to be out in the middle of this beautiful place, blaring country music. And so to Ricky, he just couldn't help but feel like there's something off about these two guys. They just seem really disrespectful and kind of pushy and maybe aggressive. And so Ricky is just not happy. But again, Ricky didn't say anything and didn't attempt to leave because again, he's really hungry and so is his dog and he needs to eat that fish. A moment later, Scott walked back from the truck and took a seat next to Sean, and then he, along with Sean, pulled out their knives and began deboning the fish. And as they were doing this, Ricky again is just kind of sitting there doing nothing, and so he kind of meagerly asked, hey, can you give me a knife and I'll clean a fish? But Sean and Scott kind of waved him off and said, don't worry, we got this. And so Ricky just continued to sit there nervously as all he could watch was the flashing of the light bouncing off their blades. But eventually, Scott and Sean finished deboning all the fish and they put their knives away. And at that point, they began cooking the fish over the open flame. And suddenly for Ricky, it felt like, the mood had shifted a little bit. At least now the two men were not fiddling around with weapons. It felt kind of safe again. And so Ricky began making some small talk in hopes that would kind of, settle his nerves. And so Ricky told the two men about how much he loved the Appalachian Trail and how he came out here all the time for weeks at a time with his dog. And Ricky would tell the men that, sometimes he felt more at home out in the wild than he did at home. It was almost like being out in nature was a religious experience for Ricky. And he would even tell Sean and Scott that sometimes when he was out in nature, he would meditate and pray and even do some chanting like part of a ritual. I mean, he was really trying to be in tune with Mother Nature. But as Ricky continued to tell Sean and Scott about his personal life, he noticed the two men were definitely paying attention and kind of nodding along at appropriate points in the story. But at the same time, Ricky felt like these two men were also kind of looking at him like Ricky was kind of weird. As if they were not prepared to come out and say it, but after hearing all these things about his life, it was like, what's going on with this guy? And so Ricky suddenly felt really embarrassed about being so open with these two guys who once again just seem like they don't quite like him or even really want him here. But luckily, right at that moment, the fish were done, and so the men just sat there in silence and wolfed down the food. By the time they finished, right about 8 p.m., it was very dark outside, and Ricky at this point is just ready to go. He just felt so uneasy here. And so after putting down his plate and his silverware and saying thank you to Sean and Scott for their hospitality, he quickly got up and grabbed his dog, and he began walking into the woods towards his campsite. But after Ricky and his dog had walked maybe 10 or 15 feet away from this campsite, two things happened in rapid succession. Number one, Ricky suddenly stopped and turned around and looked back at the campsite. And number two, right as he did this, there was this enormous bang sound, like a small explosion that echoed through the forest. About 30 minutes later, and about 4 miles away from where Ricky and Sean and Scott had been, there were these two women who were in their house eating dinner when they heard this sudden frantic knocking on their front door. Now, these women live in a very isolated part of the country, and so the women were very concerned. One of them rushed over to the phone just to be ready to call the police, while the other very carefully made their way towards the front of the house, and they kind of peered out the window, but they couldn't see anything outside. It was too dark. And so they went to their door, which was still getting pounded on by whoever was out there. And the woman, she unlocked the door and she opened it just a crack. And what she saw nearly made her faint. There was a man standing on her porch who was absolutely covered in blood, as if he had been fully submerged in a tank of blood. I mean, he is all red. And the man had his hand over his neck. And the woman who opened the door, she looked at him and she saw that there was this rhythmic pulsing of blood pumping out of his neck that was in time with his heart. This man is clearly bleeding to death. And so the woman, she screamed for the other woman to please call 911. We have someone who's dying here. And so she began calling 911. And then the man on the porch just said, please help me. And then he said something about Dismal Creek. And then he collapsed. And this was so shocking for the woman who had opened the door that she just stood there staring, having no idea what to do. But then she happened to look up and she noticed there was a Jeep that was idling out on the road in front of her house that she hadn't even registered until now. And so either this guy got dropped off or he drove that Jeep. But before she could even begin to understand what had just happened, an ambulance and a whole bunch of police cars came screaming up and parked in front of her house. And then the medics got out, they rushed up, and they grabbed the bleeding man, and they put him in the ambulance, and they rushed him off. Meanwhile, not far from the house, police officers were speeding towards Dismal Creek, because when the women called 911, they said, this guy who's shown up on the porch bleeding said something about Dismal Creek, but they had no idea what it was about. And so instead of trying to wait to figure out what was even going on, police had basically said, let's just go to Dismal Creek and look around and see if we can figure out, why someone would leave that area and show up at this house covered in blood. But as the police were making their way up this winding mountain road, they saw a truck bombing down the road coming straight at them. And the truck, they initially hit their brakes and did kind of attempt to get out of the way of the police cars. But after this truck had basically come to a stop, the driver of the truck just hit the gas all over again, and they veered wildly off the side of the road into an embankment, and they crashed and flipped several times and then came to a stop. And the police officers who had veered to the side of the road to avoid getting hit by this truck, they just watched this happen and they couldn't understand why the driver had gunned it again after stopping and then seemingly intentionally drove off the road. It almost seemed like the driver was trying to crash. And so the police, they got out of their car and they approached the wrecked truck with their guns drawn. But when they looked into the vehicle, they saw there was a single occupant, the driver, and he was still somehow alive. So the police got him out of the vehicle and they called an ambulance, but they actually sent an officer with the ambulance to escort them because the police were actually pretty suspicious of this truck driver. Because remember, they were going up that road to get to Dismal Creek to see what had happened there that would lead to another man showing up on somebody's doorstep in the middle of the night covered in blood. And now they have this truck driver who looks like he's speeding away from Dismal Creek, who crashes his truck. I mean, there was no clear connection between the truck crash and the bloody guy, but the police were suspicious that they had to be connected. So they sent the officer to the hospital as well. About 30 minutes after the truck crash, the police left the scene and continued the rest of the way up the road to Dismal Creek. And once they got up there, the police fanned out all across the area and just began looking for anything. Just any clue that might explain what the heck happened here, if anything happened at Dismal Creek at all. And pretty quickly, the police actually did find something unique. In the middle of the Dismal Creek area, they found a campsite. But it was not the campsite where Sean and Scott were staying, where Ricky had gone and shared dinner with them. This was a different campsite. And not long after searching this other campsite, police concluded that whoever was staying here did not seem like they were mentally well. This seems like a mentally unstable and potentially dangerous person lives here. So the campsite was really simple. It was just a tent and a campfire. But when the police lifted up the flap and looked inside the tent, they found a collection of 30 knives along with a police scanner that basically picked up police radio chatter in the area, so you could listen to a scanner and basically know what the police were doing in your area. There were also all these weird piles of clothing. Some were for kids, some were for adults, some were for men, some were for women. There were piles of eyeglasses, and there were 8 pairs of women's underwear. And then also there was a map of the Appalachian Trail inside of this tent, and all over this map along the trail were all these spots that were circled, but there was no information about what these circles meant. However, one of the places that was circled was Dismal Creek. And then next to the map was a radio, and inside the radio was a cassette. And so the police just hit play, and immediately what they heard totally creeped them out. Because the tape sounded like some kind of satanic ritual. It was basically this one man's voice just kind of howling and chanting over and over again. But by far, the most shocking thing that was found inside of that tent was a single piece of paper. And this piece of paper was a birth certificate, and the name on the birth certificate was a name that basically all police in this area knew, and in fact, anybody living in or around the Appalachian Trail definitely would know this name. And the identity of this person, the name on the birth certificate, was the key to putting together all these seemingly disconnected events that had happened on this night. From the explosion when Ricky walked away from the fire, to the bloody man at the house, to the truck crash, they were all connected through this single person. A few hours earlier, after Ricky had gotten up and walked away from Sean and Scott's campsite, and then after barely making it onto the trail, he had turned around and there was that loud explosion. Well, at that point in the story, Ricky, who's now looking back at the campsite and looking at Sean and Scott, he can see that the two of them, they've heard the sound too, and they were now staring at each other with looks of absolute shock and terror on their faces. But then Ricky watched as Sean reached up and touched his face, and he put his hand out in front of his face and it was covered in red. And the reason for that was because Sean had just been shot in the face, because that loud explosion was the sound of Ricky shooting his gun at Sean. And as Sean and Scott stood there staring at each other in absolute disbelief, Ricky, who's still in the tree line, ran towards the fire and just kept on shooting. And so Sean at this point, as he sees Ricky coming into the campsite, he stands up and kind of staggers back and falls on the ground. But Scott, who's not hurt at this point, he just gets up and starts running away from the campsite. And Ricky turns his attention towards Scott and he shoots at him and he hits him straight in the neck and also in the back. But somehow Scott just kept on running despite these horrible wounds. And so Ricky watched as Scott disappeared into the woods. And then Ricky turned back to Sean, who's laying on the ground and can't go anywhere. He's been shot in the face. And Ricky just casually raised his gun and shot Sean right in the chest. But amazingly, Sean, after getting shot this second time, it created what must have been the most extreme adrenaline rush ever, because he jumped up to his feet and right in front of his attacker, he just turned and sprinted to his Jeep. He hopped inside, fired it up, and just sped away as fast as he could. And when Sean flipped on his headlights and turned a corner after getting away from the campsite, he looked down the road and he actually saw his buddy, Scott, who had run away first, come tumbling out of the woods onto the road. And so Sean, who's gravely injured, drives over next to Scott and he stops the Jeep long enough for Scott to climb inside, and they shut the door and they speed their way towards the nearest help, which happened to be that house where those two women lived. And so it was Scott, who looked like he was drenched in blood, who knocked on the women's door. Sean was down in the Jeep out on the road, but he was just too weak to get out and come up to the door as well. But when the ambulance and police arrived, they would find not only Scott up on the porch, but also Sean in the Jeep, and both men would be taken to the hospital via helicopter. And then as for the man who was driving the truck down the road away from Dismal Creek, who then crashed right in front of the police, well, the driver of that truck was Ricky Williams. However, that was not his real name. There was no Ricky Williams. That was the name he just used. His real name, which was on the birth certificate that police found in that other campsite inside of the tent, was Randall Lee Smith. The same infamous Randall Lee Smith who had murdered those two hikers not far from Dismal Creek. That double homicide had happened in 1981, and Randall was caught and convicted. But he was paroled 15 years later in 1996 for good behavior. And for 10 years after that, Randall lived with his mother and he wore this electronic bracelet and, he followed the rules. But by 2008, his electronic bracelet had came off, and even though Randall had attempted to continue living with his mother, it just wasn't tenable, he didn't have enough money, and so ultimately he packed up his things, grabbed his dog, and moved out onto the Appalachian Trail. And on May 6th, 2008, when Sean and Scott arrived in Dismal Creek to go fishing, Randall was waiting. Nobody has any idea why Randall murdered those two hikers back in 1981, or why he targeted Sean and Scott in 2008. All we know is that Randall Lee Smith was very mentally unwell and very likely viewed the Appalachian Trail as like his sacred place. This is his home. This is the place he loves more than anything. And so maybe, he felt like Sean and Scott had somehow disrespected the Appalachian Trail, and that was enough to attack them. Now, we know Sean and Scott did not do anything intentionally disrespectful to Randall because, amazingly, Sean and Scott survived this attack. And they would say that when they saw Randall, they just felt bad for him. They thought he was like this alcoholic drifter who didn't have a home of his own, and so he was just living out in the woods on the Appalachian Trail. And so they didn't judge him. Instead, they really did just want to give him some food and spend some time with him and make him feel human again. That was it. And because Randall appeared to be this kind of small, older man, Sean and Scott, who were, very big and imposing, they didn't feel threatened by this guy. As for that bizarre other campsite that police found up around Dismal Creek, the one that contained all those knives and the birth certificate, well, obviously, that was Randall's campsite. And that weird cassette tape that they listened to that sounded like a satanic ritual, that was Randall going through his meditations and chants that he would do when he was out in the middle of nowhere. It was like his way of respecting Mother Nature and the Appalachian Trail. And then all those items that were found inside of his tent, the different clothes and the eyeglasses and the women's underwear, it's believed those could be Randall's other victims. However, when police pulled DNA samples from all of those items that were found inside of his tent, like the clothes and the underwear and the eyeglasses, well, those DNA samples did not match any of the missing people or murder victims in the police's database, and so that wasn't useful. And then also, police went to all those places on that map that were circled, and with the exception of obviously Dismal Creek, they didn't find anything else at the other locations that suggested any violent event had happened there. So only Randall knows the truth, which means we will never know the truth, because just 4 days after Randall was pulled out of that truck that he crashed, he died in police custody from a blood clot that formed as a result of the crash. And in those 4 days that Randall was in custody, he never gave up that there were any other victims. Today, Sean still has a bullet in his head and in his chest, and Scott still has big scarring on his neck and on his back. But both men have made a full recovery, relatively speaking, and they still go back to Dismal Creek all the time to go camping and fishing. Thank you for listening to the Mr. Ballin podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, not just this one, but also Mr. Ballen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballin Studios on any podcast platform, and you'll find all of them. If you want to watch hundreds more strange, dark, and mysterious stories, just head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called Mr.